"Did you like the lake house I gave you, Mom?" Daniel asked, setting his car keys down on the polished oak table as if the question were as ordinary as passing the salt. And for a moment Margaret Collins simply looked at him, her expression calm, almost pleasant, though something behind her eyes had already gone still, because she had never seen any lake house, had never signed for one, had never even heard him mention such a gift before this exact second. Yet here he was, standing in her dining room on Thanksgiving Day, coat still on, voice casual, as though he were confirming something already agreed upon, something already real, and she felt the weight of the room shift in a way no one else seemed to notice. The turkey rested in the center of the table, golden and untouched, the scent of rosemary and butter still lingering in the air, the kind of meal she had spent all morning preparing alone, waking before sunrise to preheat the oven, to set the table with her best china, the same set she had saved for decades, the one she used only when she believed family still meant something worth honoring. And now she stood there, hands folded lightly in front of her, as if the question hadn't just placed her inside a conversation she didn't belong to. Emily, Daniel's wife, was by the window, adjusting the curtains that didn't need adjusting, her back turned just long enough to avoid the moment. And that was when Margaret noticed it, not in what was said, but in what wasn't, the silence that followed Daniel's question. The brief pause that lingered a fraction too long, like a line rehearsed but not perfectly delivered. Margaret gave a small nod, the kind that could mean anything, the kind that asked for nothing, her lips forming a faint smile that never quite reached her eyes, because she had learned, over the years, that reacting too quickly only gave others the advantage. And Daniel, successful as he was now, a man with tailored suits and a company people mentioned with admiration, had developed a habit of speaking in statements disguised as questions, as though reality itself could be adjusted by the tone of his voice. She stepped closer to the table, adjusting a fork that didn't need adjusting, her movements precise, measured, buying herself time in a way no one could accuse her of, because if there was one thing Margaret Collins understood, it was that truth rarely arrived all at once. It revealed itself in fragments, in misplaced words, in casual assumptions spoken too soon. And right now, her son had handed her one of those fragments, wrapped neatly in a question about a gift she had never received, and as she glanced briefly toward Emily, who still hadn't turned around, she felt something settle quietly into place, not anger, not confusion, but recognition, the kind that comes when a story you weren't told begins to unfold right in front of you, piece by piece, whether you're ready or not. Margaret did not answer right away. And that was the first thing that unsettled Daniel, though he did not show it, because he had grown used to quick confirmations, to people nodding before he finished speaking. But his mother simply reached for the pitcher of iced tea and poured herself a glass with steady hands, the ice shifting softly against the glass, a small, ordinary sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet room. And then she took a slow sip as if considering the taste rather than the question, as if nothing unusual had been said at all. Daniel pulled out his chair and sat down, glancing briefly toward Emily, who finally turned from the window with a polite smile that arrived a second too late, her eyes flicking toward Margaret and then away again. And that was when Margaret noticed another detail, the kind that would have meant nothing to anyone else. The way Emily's hand lingered on the back of Daniel's chair, her fingers tightening slightly before she let go, as if bracing for something that had not yet happened. "It is a beautiful day," Margaret said instead, her voice even, her tone warm enough to pass for genuine, and she gestured lightly toward the table, inviting them to sit, to eat, to continue as though everything were exactly as it should be. And for a moment Daniel hesitated, just long enough for the silence to stretch again, before he forced a small laugh and reached for the carving knife, commenting on the turkey, on how it smelled just like he remembered from when he was younger, as though memory could smooth over whatever had just been introduced. Into the room, Margaret watched him carefully, not openly, not in a way that could be called suspicious, but in the quiet, observant way she had developed over years of raising him, the way she used to watch for fevers, for late nights, for the subtle signs that something was wrong before he ever said a word. And now she saw it again, not in his face exactly, but in the way he avoided finishing his earlier thought. The way he did not repeat the question, did not clarify it, as though mentioning the lake house once had been enough. as though the subject itself had already served its purpose. Emily sat down across from Margaret, smoothing her napkin over her lap with careful precision, her smile fixed, her posture perfect, and when she finally spoke, her voice was light, almost cheerful, asking about the drive, about the neighborhood, about anything that did not touch the one thing that had already been said. And Margaret responded politely, answering each question with calm simplicity. Never rushing, never probing, allowing the conversation to drift across safe topics while holding on to that single, misplaced detail like a thread she could follow later. Outside, the late afternoon light stretched across the yard, soft and golden, the kind of light that made everything appear warmer than it really was. And inside, the three of them sat at the table, passing dishes, exchanging small talk, performing the shape of a family gathering so convincingly that, to anyone looking in, nothing would have seemed out of place. And yet Margaret could feel it clearly now, something beneath the surface, something quiet but deliberate, a story already in motion that she had not been invited into. And as she set down her glass and folded her hands neatly in front of her, she understood that whatever this lake house was, it was not a gift, and whatever her son believed he had just confirmed, it was not the truth. And she would not ask again, not yet, because answers given too easily were rarely the ones that mattered, and Margaret Collins had learned, over time, that the most important truths were the ones people tried the hardest not to explain. By the time the plates had been cleared and the evening light had faded into a quiet gray beyond the windows, Margaret had already decided that nothing more would be said that day, not because there was nothing to say, but because this was not the moment for it, and she moved through the kitchen with steady, practiced motions, rinsing dishes, placing them carefully into the dishwasher, her back turned just enough to give Daniel and Emily the space they seemed to prefer, though she could still hear them speaking in lower tones behind her, their voices blending into something indistinct, something intentionally softened, and she did not try to listen closely because she did not need to hear the words to understand the distance. When she returned to the living room, she found Daniel standing near the mantel, looking at an old photograph of himself as a boy, his arm around his father, both of them smiling in a way that felt almost unfamiliar now. And for a brief moment, Margaret saw the child he had been, the one who used to ask her questions with genuine curiosity, who used to wait for her answers, who used to believe that she knew things worth hearing, and that memory lingered just long enough to make the present feel sharper by contrast, because the man standing there now no longer asked to understand, he asked to confirm, to validate something already decided. You should come see it sometime, Daniel said without turning, his voice casual, almost rehearsed, and Margaret paused just slightly before responding, her tone light, her words measured. Perhaps I will, she said, offering nothing more, because the invitation itself told her what she needed to know, that whatever this place was, it existed in a version of reality where her presence was optional, an afterthought rather than a foundation, and she would not step into that version without first understanding its structure. Emily gathered her coat, her movements efficient, her smile returning as she thanked Margaret for dinner, her words polite, appropriate, and entirely without weight, and Margaret nodded in return, walking them to the door, the familiar routine unfolding exactly as it had so many times before, except now there was a quiet awareness beneath it, something unspoken but undeniable, and when Daniel leaned in to hug her, his embrace was brief, distracted, his attention already shifting elsewhere, and Margaret placed her hand lightly on his shoulder, holding it there for just a second longer than he expected, not to stop him, not to question him, but simply to mark the moment, to acknowledge it in a way he would not. After they left, the house settled into silence again, the kind of silence that felt larger than the space itself, and Margaret stood by the window for a moment, watching the taillights of Daniel's car disappear down the street, her expression calm, her posture steady, because whatever had been set into motion did not end with that conversation. It had only just revealed itself, and she turned away from the window, without hesitation, walking back toward the dining room where the table now sat cleared and empty, the remnants of the evening already erased, and she reached for her phone, not with urgency, not with emotion, but with the quiet certainty of someone who understood that answers were no longer going to arrive on their own. and that if there was a story being written around her, she intended to read every line of it before anyone else decided how it would end. Margaret let the conversation move past her as though she were simply another piece of furniture in the room, something familiar and unchanging, and she did not mind that illusion because it gave her something far more valuable than attention. It gave her time, and time, she knew, was where truth tended to reveal itself. She reached for her glass again, taking a small sip, her eyes lowering just enough to avoid drawing notice, yet still aware of every movement around her, the way Daniel leaned back slightly when he spoke about investments, the way Emily nodded just a fraction too quickly, as if affirming something that had already been agreed upon elsewhere, and Margaret understood that what she was witnessing was not a conversation, but a continuation, a thread that had begun long before she entered it. "It is a good market right now," Daniel said, his tone measured, confident, the kind of voice that expected agreement without asking for it, and Margaret gave a slight nod, not because she agreed, but because she recognized the rhythm, the pattern of someone presenting information not to share it, but to establish a version of reality that others would accept without question. Emily added something about timing, about how opportunities did not wait, her voice light, almost rehearsed, and Margaret noticed how their words overlapped just enough to suggest coordination, not intentional. Perhaps, but practiced, like a story told more than once. The details were small, almost invisible, but Margaret had spent a lifetime understanding that the smallest details often carried the greatest weight, and she began to see how they fit together, not clearly yet, but enough to form the outline of something deliberate. She thought back to a call from 2 months ago, when Daniel had mentioned looking into something by the water, his words vague at the time, easy to dismiss, and then another call, shorter, more hurried, where he had spoken about paperwork, about closing timelines, about things that had seemed distant from her life, and now those fragments returned, aligning themselves quietly in her mind, each one connecting to the next, forming a picture that had been there all along, just waiting to be seen. Margaret set her napkin down beside her plate, smoothing it once with careful precision, her movements calm, controlled, because there was no urgency in her, no need to rush toward a conclusion that would only be incomplete, and she had learned, through years of watching, of listening, that the truth did not need to be chased, it only needed to be recognized when it appeared. Daniel laughed at something Emily said, a light, easy sound that filled the room just enough to cover the silence beneath it, and Margaret looked at him then, not as a mother looking at her son, but as someone observing a stranger whose choices were no longer guided by the same values she had once believed she had taught him, and that realization did not come with anger, not even disappointment, but with a quiet clarity, the understanding that whatever had been done with intention, and that intention would leave traces. She shifted slightly in her chair, her posture still composed, her expression unchanged, because there was no reason to reveal what she was beginning to see. Not when the others believed she saw nothing at all, and that belief, she realized, was their greatest mistake, because it allowed her to remain exactly where she was, unnoticed, unchallenged, and fully aware. And as the conversation drifted once more into safer topics, into plans and schedules and the kind of details that filled space without meaning anything, Margaret continued to listen, not for what was said, but for what was not, for the gaps, the omissions, the careful avoidance of anything that might connect too clearly to that one question asked earlier. And in those gaps, she found enough to understand that the story being told around her was not meant for her benefit, and that meant it was something she would have to uncover on her own, quietly, patiently, and completely. The next morning arrived without urgency, the pale winter light stretching slowly across the kitchen floor as Margaret moved through her routine with quiet precision, preparing her coffee the same way she always had, measuring each step without distraction, because routine, she believed, was where clarity often returned. And as she sat at the small table by the window, she opened her laptop, not with hesitation, but with purpose, her mind already aligned with what needed to be done next. She did not search randomly, did not follow curiosity in scattered directions. Instead, she moved directly toward the information that mattered, pulling up public property records, the kind anyone could access if they knew where to look. And she had always known where to look, even if she had rarely needed to. And as the page loaded, she entered the name she had seen the night before, the one that had appeared just slightly out of place, close enough to be familiar, yet distant enough to require confirmation, and she waited, her fingers resting lightly on the keyboard, her expression unchanged, because she was not hoping for anything. She was verifying. The results appeared in a list, clean, official, undeniable, and Margaret read them slowly, line by line, her eyes steady, her breathing even, because there was no surprise left in her now, only recognition. And there it was, a property located near a lake, purchased within the last few months, the timing aligning perfectly with everything she had begun to piece together, and more importantly, the ownership, clearly stated, leaving no room for interpretation. The name listed was not hers, not even partially, but Emily's, full and unambiguous, with Daniel connected only through a business entity that had facilitated the transaction, structured carefully, legally sound, and entirely excluding Margaret from any formal connection. She did not react, did not lean back or close the screen or allow herself even a moment of visible emotion, because this was not the moment for that. This was the moment for understanding, and she read further, noting the purchase price, the financing details, the dates of filing, each piece fitting exactly where it should, each one confirming what she had already suspected, that the question Daniel had asked was not a misunderstanding. It was a test, a quiet attempt to establish her acceptance of something that had already been decided without her, and the realization settled fully now, not as a shock, but as a completed thought. Margaret closed the laptop slowly, her reflection faintly visible on the darkened screen, and for a moment she simply sat there, her hands folded in front of her, her posture straight, her gaze steady, because what mattered was not just what had been done, but how it had been done, the assumption that she would not notice, that she would not question, that she would accept a version of reality presented to her without looking beneath it, and that assumption, more than the property itself, revealed the true distance that had formed between her and her son. She stood up then, carrying her empty coffee cup to the sink, rinsing it with the same calm movements as always, because nothing outward had changed. The house was still quiet, the day still ordinary, and yet beneath that surface, everything had shifted into place, the pieces no longer scattered, no longer uncertain. And as she dried her hands and looked out the window at the stillness of the morning, she understood that the next steps would not be about confrontation, not yet. They would be about preparation, about ensuring that whatever had been arranged in her absence would not remain unchallenged, and she would do it the only way she trusted, quietly, thoroughly, and without giving anyone the chance to see it coming. Margaret did not delay once the truth had settled into something solid, because she understood that hesitation only gave others time to adjust, and she had no intention of allowing that. So by mid-morning she had already made a call, her voice calm and measured as she spoke with a man she had not needed in years, a lawyer who had once helped her organize her affairs after her husband passed, someone who understood not only the legal structure of things, but the importance of quiet precision. And she did not explain everything at once. She did not need to. She simply requested a review, a careful look at her current assets, her accounts, the way everything was arranged, because if something had been moved without her knowledge once, she intended to ensure it could not happen again. The meeting was scheduled without urgency, but with intention, and when Margaret arrived, she carried with her only a small folder, neatly arranged, containing just enough to begin the conversation, not everything she knew, but everything that mattered. And as she sat across from the lawyer, her posture straight, her expression composed, she listened more than she spoke, allowing him to guide the process, to ask the right questions, to identify the areas that required attention. And when he mentioned the importance of reviewing beneficiary designations, of confirming ownership structures, of ensuring that no assumptions had been built into her estate without her direct approval, Margaret gave a small nod, because that was exactly where the problem had begun. She did not mention Daniel's question, not yet. She did not mention Emily's name, because this was not about confrontation. It was about control, about understanding the full scope of what had been done and ensuring that the foundation beneath it was no longer stable. And as the discussion continued, she felt a quiet clarity settle in, the the kind that came from seeing the path ahead without obstruction. By the time she left the office, she had already taken the first steps, small changes that would not be noticed immediately, adjustments to access, to permissions, to the way information flowed. Each one subtle, each one deliberate, and none of them required explanation to anyone else, because they were hers to make. Later that afternoon, she returned home and placed the folder back in its drawer, her movements calm, unchanged, as though nothing at all had shifted, and in a way, nothing had, at least not on the surface. The house was still quiet. The rooms still held the same furniture, the same photographs, the same memories. But beneath that stillness, something had begun to move in the opposite direction of what Daniel and Emily had intended, something they could not yet see. Margaret prepared her dinner as she always did, simple, measured, taking her time with each step, because there was no rush now, no urgency to reveal what she knew. And as she sat down at the table, alone but composed, she understood that the balance had changed, not through confrontation, not through accusation, but through awareness. And awareness, she had learned, was always the first step in reclaiming what had quietly been taken. She folded her hands lightly in front of her, her gaze steady, because whatever came next would not be decided by a conversation. It would be decided by actions, quiet ones, precise ones, and she intended to take each of them without hesitation, without announcement, and without giving anyone the chance to prepare for what they had already assumed would never happen. 2 days passed before Margaret allowed any outward shift to appear, and even then it was measured, intentional, because she understood that timing was as important as truth. And when her phone rang that afternoon with Daniel's name on the screen, she let it ring once longer than usual before answering, her voice calm, steady, unchanged, as if nothing at all had been discovered. And he spoke in the same confident tone she had heard at the dinner table, mentioning casually that he and Emily were planning a small trip to the lake house over the weekend, describing it as a quiet getaway, a chance to relax. And then, almost as an afterthought, he extended an invitation, asking if she would like to come and see it for herself, framing it as a generous gesture, something meant to include her, to make her feel part of something that had already been decided. Margaret listened without interruption, allowing him to finish, her silence not empty but deliberate, because she was measuring, not just his words, but the space between them, the assumptions they carried. And when she responded, her tone was warm, almost light. She said that it sounded lovely, that she would consider it, that she appreciated the invitation, and she left it there, offering nothing more, no questions, no confirmations, because she had already learned what she needed from the way he presented it. After the call ended, she did not sit down immediately. Instead, she walked slowly through the house, her gaze moving across the familiar details, the photographs, the furniture, the quiet evidence of a life built carefully over time. And she paused briefly at the framed picture of Daniel as a young boy, his expression open, unguarded, a version of him that had never needed to explain or conceal anything. And she allowed herself a moment to acknowledge the distance between that memory and the man who had just spoken to her, not with sadness, but with clarity, because understanding did not require emotion, it required honesty. Later that evening, she returned to her desk and opened her laptop once more, this time not to search, but to act, and she began drafting a message, not to Daniel, not to Emily, but to the lawyer she had met with, outlining the next steps with careful precision, confirming the changes they had discussed, requesting additional reviews, ensuring that every detail was aligned exactly as she intended. And as she typed, her movements were steady, her thoughts clear, because there was no longer any uncertainty about what needed to be done. She did not rush, did not send the message until she had read it twice, ensuring that every word served its purpose. And when she finally clicked send, she felt no sense of finality, only continuation. Because this was not an ending, it was the beginning of something that would unfold quietly, beyond the reach of assumptions that had already been made about her. The following morning, she made a decision about the invitation, not by calling, not by sending a message, but by preparing, selecting a simple coat, placing her keys by the door, arranging her schedule so that nothing would interfere, because she had decided she would go, not as a guest, not as someone being shown a gift, but as someone who intended to see the full shape of what had been built in her absence. And as she stood by the window, looking out at the stillness of the street, she understood that the weekend would not be about discovery. It would be about confirmation, and she would arrive with everything she needed already in place, long before anyone realized that the balance they believed to be secure had already begun to shift beneath them. Margaret arrived just before noon. The sky stretched wide and pale above the quiet road that led to the lake, and as she stepped out of her car, she took a moment to observe the house from a distance, not with admiration, but with attention, noting the structure, the positioning, the way it sat confidently near the water as though it had always belonged there. And when Daniel opened the door with a welcoming smile, his tone warm, his gestures easy, she returned that same calm presence, allowing the moment to unfold exactly as expected, because there was no need to disrupt what had already been carefully arranged. Inside, the house was polished, thoughtfully designed, every detail aligned with a vision of comfort and success, and Emily moved through the space with quiet confidence, offering small explanations about the layout, the finishes, the view from the windows, speaking as someone who belonged there fully. And Margaret listened, her gaze steady, her expression composed, because what mattered was not what was being shown, but what was being assumed, and she recognized that assumption in every sentence, in every gesture, the quiet expectation that she would see this as a gift, as something generous, something inclusive. Even though the foundation beneath it told a different story, they walked through each room, Daniel occasionally pointing out features, mentioning plans for the future, expansions, gatherings, possibilities that extended beyond the present moment, and Margaret followed at a measured pace, taking in not just the space, but the language surrounding it, the way ownership was implied without being directly stated, the way decisions were presented as shared even when they clearly were not, and she allowed it all to continue without interruption, because she had not come to question, she had come to confirm. Eventually, they reached the back of the house where large windows opened toward the lake, the water, still and reflective under the afternoon light, and Daniel paused there, turning slightly toward her, asking again if she liked it, his tone lighter this time, as though the answer had already been decided, and Margaret met his gaze with the same calm steadiness she had carried throughout the visit, and for a brief moment, there was silence, not uncomfortable, but revealing, because in that space, without distraction, the weight of the question became clear. She answered simply, saying that it was a beautiful house, that the location was well chosen, that it had clearly been planned with care, and she let her words rest there, offering nothing beyond what was true, nothing that could be interpreted as agreement, nothing that could be used to support the narrative that had been quietly built around her absence. Daniel nodded, satisfied enough, and the conversation shifted again, moving back to lighter topics, to plans for lunch, to small details that carried no weight, and Margaret allowed it because she had already seen what she needed to see, not just the house, but the structure of the situation itself, and as they sat down together, the sunlight stretching across the table, she felt no urgency to reveal anything, no need to correct or confront, because the balance had already shifted in ways they did not yet understand. When the visit ended and she returned to her car, she paused once more before leaving, looking back at the house one final time, not with attachment, not with resentment, but with clarity, because it was no longer a question of what had been done, it was a matter of what would come next. And as she drove away, the road unfolding quietly ahead of her, she carried with her not uncertainty, but a steady resolve, knowing that everything she needed was already in motion, set carefully into place, beyond the reach of assumptions that had once excluded her, and that whatever came next would not be shaped by what had been hidden, but by what she had chosen to see clearly and act upon without hesitation.